The room was silent, except for the rattle of a teleprinter and the low hum of ceiling fans fighting the Hawaiian heat. A young Navy codebreaker leaned over a fresh Japanese transmission. Just another string of numbers, or so everyone thought. Then his hand froze. The pencil slipped from his fingers. "Sir, you need to see this," he whispered. The officer beside him scanned the line once, then twice. His eyes widened. "Oh God, we know exactly where they're going." That moment, one nearly invisible pattern inside Japan's most secret naval code would flip the Pacific War on its head. But before we get to the full story of what they said and how they cracked it, you need to understand why this single message sent shockwaves through the American code-breaking unit known as Station HYPO. Because at the time, no one believed JN-25 could be broken. Not this fast, not by this team, and definitely not before Japan struck again. In early 1942, the world still echoed with the shockwaves of Pearl Harbor. The United States was scrambling, desperate to understand Japan's next move. And deep beneath the bustle of Pearl Harbor Naval Station, a cramped, windowless basement housed the one group tasked with finding those answers. Station HYPO. It wasn't glamorous. There were no cinematic spy gadgets, no dramatic chases, just worn desks, clattering machines, and stacks of incomprehensible Japanese numbers. The code they were up against, JN-25, wasn't just difficult. It was engineered to be unbreakable, layers of encipherment wrapped around thousands of numerical groups. Even the most optimistic analysts estimated it would take years to crack. Yet HYPO's small team, linguists, mathematicians, misfits, and a commander who wore a red smoking jacket, was convinced Japan's secrets were hidden in plain sight. Every day they sifted through intercepted messages, trying to catch the tiniest irregularity, a repeated phrase, a numerical echo, a glitch in Japan's flawless radio discipline. Most days they found nothing, but they kept pushing because the stakes were terrifyingly clear. If they didn't figure out Japan's next target in time, the next Pearl Harbor might be only days away. Inside Station HYPO, the war wasn't fought with rifles. It was fought with pencils, paper, and minds sharp enough to carve through numerical fog. At the center of it all stood Commander Joseph Rochefort, a brilliant, eccentric officer who preferred silk slippers and a worn red smoking jacket over standard Navy formality. He had a way of seeing patterns where others saw chaos, an instinct that unnerved his superiors, but inspired absolute loyalty among his team. Beside him worked Thomas Dyer, quiet and analytical, the kind of man who could spend 12 hours staring at a single column of numbers without breaking focus. Then there was Donald Showers, young, sharp, and relentless, constantly proposing theories that seemed crazy until they weren't. And though she wasn't stationed in HYPO at that moment, the shadow of Agnes Meyer Driscoll, Miss Aggie, the Navy's legendary codebreaker, hung over every desk. Many of HYPO's techniques were built on foundations she'd laid years earlier. These weren't typical warriors. Some were introverts who hated speaking in meetings. Some were math prodigies who never quite fit the military mold. Some were self-taught savants who simply refused to believe any code was impossible. But each of them understood the same terrifying truth. If they missed a clue, American sailors would die. And that pressure forged them into something far stronger than anyone in Washington expected. For months, HYPO's analysts chipped away at fragments of JN-25 like miners working in total darkness. They weren't breaking the code outright. They were slowly feeling the shape of something hidden behind it. Most intercepted Japanese messages still looked like meaningless grids of numbers. But tiny irregularities began to surface. Barely noticeable slips in phrasing, repeated digits where there shouldn't have been any, odd timing patterns in routine dispatches. One afternoon, a seemingly ordinary weather report flickered through the intercept channel. Showers stared at the sequence long enough for a knot to form in his stomach. Something was off. He called Dyer over. Then Rochefort. The message wasn't important on its own, but the numerical structure beneath it was a hair different from the usual pattern. It meant only one thing. Japan was preparing a major operation, and parts of the codebook had shifted. The room changed instantly. The usual quiet boredom snapped into electric focus. Every operator, every linguist, every analyst suddenly had the same mission: find the anomaly, chase it, break it open before Japan moved. Days blurred into nights. Coffee cups multiplied. Paper stacks grew like walls around desks. And beneath the surface, tension kept rising. Because HYPO's analysts knew the truth Washington didn't want to face. Japan wasn't slowing down. They were accelerating, and something big was coming. But no one yet knew where. The breakthrough didn't arrive with a triumphant shout or some cinematic moment of clarity. It came quietly, almost too quietly to notice. Another intercepted message slid across the desk, wrapped in the same impenetrable JN25 numbers. But as Dyer traced the numerical groups with his pencil, he stopped halfway through the page. One sequence, just 5 digits, felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain. He pulled older intercepts, compared, cross-checked. The same cluster appeared again and again, always tied to logistics requests, supply chain chatter, and urgent routing. Rochefort leaned over his shoulder. Where have we seen this before? They worked backward through weeks of traffic. Patterns began to merge into something terrifyingly coherent. A location, referred to only as AF, was receiving unusual attention from the Japanese fleet. Fuel allocations, carrier movements, resupply demands. HYPO had seen references to AF before. Washington insisted it was anywhere from Fiji to India. Others guessed it was a deception. But the math didn't lie. There were too many indicators. Too much weight behind this single target. Showers exhaled slowly, almost in disbelief. If this is real, if AF is where I think it is... Rochefort didn't let him finish. He knew. They all knew. The room went still, dead still, as the horrifying implication settled over them. Japan was preparing to strike Midway, and HYPO had just uncovered the first clear proof. It was the moment everything shifted, from educated guesswork to chilling certainty, and the moment the Codebreakers realized their discovery could change the entire course of the Pacific War, if they could convince Washington to listen. When the final confirmation arrived, it wasn't a dramatic flare or a grand declaration. It was a handful of stunned voices in a dimly lit basement, realizing they had just solved the most important riddle of the Pacific War. The message had come in at dawn, another routine intercept dumped onto Rochefort's desk. But this time, the phrasing matched their predictions exactly. The numerical groups aligned perfectly with the logistical build-up they'd tracked for days. Rochefort stared at the paper for several seconds before speaking. "Read it again," he said quietly. Dyer already had. His voice cracked just slightly as he replied, "I did. It's Midway. There's no question." Across the room, someone muttered, almost in disbelief. "Then that means we know the strike date and the carrier force." Showers leaned back in his chair and let out a breath he'd been holding for hours. My God, we actually caught them. There was no cheering, no celebration, just a long, heavy silence as the weight of what they'd uncovered settled on every pair of shoulders in the room. Because the moment they cracked the message, truly cracked it, they understood the consequences. Thousands of American lives suddenly depended on a handful of analysts who had spent months being dismissed as alarmists. Rochefort finally broke the silence. "Send it up, all of it. Washington needs this now." Then, almost under his breath, "Let's hope they believe us this time." It wasn't a line from a movie. It was the exact mixture of relief, dread, and responsibility spoken by the people who had just changed the future of the Pacific, using nothing but their minds. Once HYPO sent the decoded intelligence to Washington, the atmosphere inside the basement shifted from tense concentration to something far more exhausting. Waiting. Waiting to see whether anyone in command would believe them. Waiting to see whether their months of work would actually save lives. Waiting to see if Japan would unknowingly walk into the trap they had just set. Washington hesitated. Some admirals still doubted Rochefort's analysis, insisting Japan would target a different island, or that HYPO was misreading the patterns. But Admiral Chester Nimitz trusted his codebreakers. He moved his carriers toward Midway, risking nearly everything on intelligence born inside a sailor's cramped, windowless office. And then, almost immediately, the consequences of HYPO's breakthrough rippled across the Pacific. American aircraft were positioned exactly where they needed to be. Patrol routes were adjusted, supplies were shifted, defenses strengthened. Every decision sharpened by the invisible work of a handful of analysts no one outside the Navy had ever heard of. When Japan launched its real attack, they sailed straight into a perfectly laid American ambush. Midway was not just a victory, it was the turning point of the Pacific War. 4 Japanese carriers lost, Japan's momentum shattered, the psychological balance of the entire conflict reversed, and it all traced back to a moment in Station HYPO when a pencil dropped, a room froze, and a few stunned voices whispered the words that changed everything. They hadn't just cracked a code, they had rewritten the future. But here's the part most people never hear. Even after HYPO delivered the decoded evidence, even after Nimitz acted on it, many in Washington still refuse to believe that Rochefort's team had pinpointed Japan's target. Some senior officers were convinced the Japanese were running a massive deception. Others thought HYPO simply got lucky, and that disbelief pushed Rochefort to make a decision that would become legendary. He ordered a message broadcast from Midway, an unencrypted, seemingly routine report claiming the island's water desalination system had broken. Japan intercepted it. Hours later, their encrypted channels relayed that AF is short on water. That single phrase proved everything HYPO had been saying. It was the final piece, the undeniable confirmation, the moment the entire intelligence community realized Station HYPO was right. And yet, most of the codebreakers who saved Midway slipped back into obscurity after the battle. No parades, no medals, no headlines, just more numbers, more intercepts, more long nights in that same dim basement. Only decades later did their story escape the shadows, and even now, much of what they said, discovered, and endured survives only in fragments, buried in declassified archives. But the truth is this: a handful of quiet, stubborn analysts changed world history, and they did it not with weapons, but with pure human insight. If you want more stories like this, real moments where tiny decisions altered the fate of nations, make sure to subscribe. We're just getting started.